welcome to kind of a special edition of kind of the Organization of Science PDW, and thank you to each and every one of you guys for coming, right? So just to give you a bit of background, right? A bunch of colleagues and myself, we've been running this workshop for a number of years, and kind of the motivation and premise of this workshop is threefold. So first of all, I think we're all gathered here because we have this kind of deep and abiding love of scientists and the work that they do. And from my own personal perspective, part of the motivation here is to kind of develop a community around this reciprocal relationship between management scholars, right, scholars of organizations, and the scientists themselves. So it's my deep, very firmly held belief that there remains a lot of work to be done examining the activities of scientists from management scholars, right? There's a lot of us, there's a lot that we can contribute to the community of scholarship. And at the same time, it's also my belief that this relationship is reciprocal. What do I mean by that? For us as management scholars, we can not only contribute part of our expertise to this community that is somewhat removed, right, from all of our conversations that we commonly have, but we can also learn quite a bit from studying the scientists themselves, right? Just scan through this hugely impactful literature. And I see some of Susan's work, right? Through Bruno Latour, through Merton, studying scientists has been incredibly useful for us as social scientists ourselves. Today we've got a great lineup, in my opinion. I don't see Chuck here, right? Chuck was here from Stanford, and maybe there was, yet another technical hiccup. I will give a virtual shout out from him. But what we do have here is Matt Marks from BU. Matt Marks, I saw that wave there, who has done longstanding work on mobility patterns, as well as Waverly Ding. Waverly, you want to give us a wave? Waverly Ding from the University of Maryland, who's done, long-standing, I guess I can say that for, 10, 20 years, is that right? Examining the determinants of academic commercialization and gender dynamics. And lastly, I should introduce myself. My name is Chris Liu. I'm at the University of Oregon. I've been working for some time on spatial networks, but primarily I work on scientific labs. A few notes about the format for the next hour or the 50 minutes or so. As you may have noticed, it's a bit of an unusual year, right? We are here in August. I don't know where this year has gone. I don't know if any of us can really remember March, right? So rather than having kind of the standard research presentations from a series of panelists, I'm hoping for kind of just a much looser format, right? We're in uncharted waters here. So I thought I would be the organizer to stick my neck out and try something new. And on top of my mind, right, kind of on top of what I suspect is all of our minds, is this ongoing pandemic, this COVID crisis. It's affecting us, it's affecting all of us around the world. And the impact on the community of scientists is particularly jarring. Okay, laboratories, universities have shut down, and suddenly experiments can't be done. So the key question that has been on my mind, right, for these past 6 months is not just about myself, but what is it, right, that is going on? What opportunities for research might this pandemic afford for us as the community of management scholars, right? Is there something, interesting going on that we can use to our benefit as a community of scholarship? So the plan is just as follows, right? Let's cycle through, right? First, we can start off with Matt, if that's okay with you. Let's cycle through from Matt to Waverly to myself. I can ask them a couple leading comments, and let's hear some of their thoughts relating to kind of their work, their thoughts, their longstanding expertise on the COVID crisis, right? On what the events are right now as things are going on. And then we just want to open it up, right? Open it up to a broad discussion amongst you. And the goal is to have a general discussion among the audience members. Overall, I'm hoping that this session will last about an hour, no more than that. but I'll stay on a little bit afterwards to have some one-on-ones and to give some guidance. Any questions before we kind of jump into that, before we move forward on that? No? This is the standard Zoom silence. So I still do not see.
Chris, can
Yes.
I make a suggestion? So, Matt, so maybe you can appoint one of us to be a moderator for you, so that I see it's a great kind of setup, because we have less than 50 people, so everybody shows up on one screen. If you click the show 50 pictures on the screen together, so it's great. We can see everybody on the same screen. So one of us can be your moderator in case there are questions, and then the moderator can call the questions while you're talking or after you're talking.
Sure. Waverly, are you volunteering?
Yeah, I can be yours, if you want.
You mean so a pairwise moderated interaction?
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Sure.
I can't moderate when I'm talking myself. So one of us got to be assigned for another person.
A circle, and why don't I moderate for Matt, if that's cool with Matt?
Yeah, sure. Question though, where's the whole raise your hand thing? Does any people not see that? Should be a button.
That usually goes with the
Where is it?
The participant list. You have to click on participants.
But it's not
Then,
there.
here, I'm going to put up my hand. Did my hand go up?
Oh, okay, you
Yes.
can. I guess the host can.
I don't know what those little flashing red dots are on my machine.
Okay, great. So it does work for you, just not for us. No problem.
And there's also no chat function in this version of Zoom. I just wanted to point that out too. It's Jenny Kwan, sorry.
Yeah,
No,
there must have been some auto update or something on this. My apologies for that. This is not optimal. So thanks for pointing that out, Jenny. You know, it's 50 participants, so it seems to be a manageable size, right? So just raise your hand as Susan has shown us, and keep it raised if I miss you. Yeah.
Susan, can you tell us again where exactly the participants?
At the bottom of the screen, there is a bar. On the left is the mute button, then the video button, then there's blank, and then comes participants, share screen, record, reactions, and all the way on the right is the button for leave. But as several people have mentioned, the chat button, which is usually, I think, between participants and share screen, is not showing on this. I was in Zooms at 9 and 10 o'clock, and they were here. But when I logged on to your address and password, it required that I get an update the Zoom. I updated it, so I don't know if it's generic, it's your machine, it's, you know, but my 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock meetings had chat.
Yeah.
But I logged on with your address, not my MIT.
And I've used chat before, but
Yeah, I don't have any chat problem in the morning. It's a different meeting. So this is probably.
Yeah, my apologies. It's probably my
I'm
machine.
sorry to interrupt. It may actually be because this is a webinar. It's not a meeting. So chat doesn't exist in the webinar. There should be a Q&A though, which is not there. But in the webinar mode, the chat does not exist. So if this is a webinar, that could be the answer, but I don't know.
Yeah, so, you know, we have, you know, peculiar functionality, but, you know, I think to the extent that this resembles, you know, those standard conference rooms that we're all so used to, raise your hand, right? Or just unmute yourself. You know, we're all grad students and academics here. Feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. You know, that has worked so far. Thank you, Valentina, for coming in. So just go ahead and do that. Yeah. So why don't we go ahead and get started with Matt, if that's okay with you. So I guess in some ways what Matt made me think about is he's, you know, for quite some time he's worked on mobility, and I don't think any of us can ignore this consequence of the COVID shutdown, which is that mobility has been shut down, right? You know, there's, you know, anything from sports teams to employees, right, not traveling, to the lack of conferences. Look at us all here with minimal functionality, to these freezes on university hirings. You know, Matt, maybe you could just give us some thoughts. You know, what's running through your mind, right? What are the short and long-term consequences of kind of this slowdown? Yeah, I'll pass it over.
Okay. All right, Chris, I'll go then. And you're not gonna like this, but do you mind if I do some slides? Is that okay?
No, absolutely.
Okay. I threw some stuff together last night because you got me thinking. So let me just let's see. Not
tell me slides are working.
No, slides better work. Slides don't work, we're all in big trouble. Is that working now? You can see that? Okay, so here's what I want to talk about what I'm going to call from Craigslist to eBay, the delocalization of research life. There's not much science behind this, but well, let me just get started. So the first thing I want to say is that obviously things have changed a lot, and not in all good ways. At the same time, I think we can relax a little bit because we have it a lot easier than many people. I don't know if you know anybody who runs a restaurant or any sort of retail establishment where things are just dramatically different. But we're in an industry where most universities are stable, you know, short-term things, but they'll be fine. And where our industry is actually in a way a little counter-cyclical. Like, for example, at our last faculty meeting, we heard that MBA enrollment is up, not down. Because what do people do when the economy is in bad shape? They go back to school. So I don't want to say things are easy. I just do want to have us think about how good we have it in many ways. So the analogy I want to draw is, I want to start with Craigslist. So everybody uses Craigslist, everybody knows Craigslist, and what do we know about Craigslist? We know that Craigslist is very local, right? There's a Philadelphia Craigslist, but there's an Allentown, there's a Scranton, there's a Craigslist for not every city, but many areas. And it's also a very level playing field. You can't pay more, I don't think, to make your listing come up sooner. There's no kind of reputation system. Just anybody can go, and this was Craig Newmark's original vision. And usually you end up making the purchase in person. I mean, you'll email or call, but then you show up, which can lead to some interesting serendipity. Like the first time I bought something on Craigslist was a pair of cycling shoes. And I got there and the guy was like, hey, while you're here, I have a multi-tool. Do you want that for $10? I'm like, sure. And I have an extra helmet. Do you want that for $5? Okay. And then he said, and by the way, I have this apartment for rent. You looking for an apartment? I'm like, no, stop. Like, this is getting weird. But, you know, you might make friends. Interesting things could happen. There's a lot of great things about Craigslist. Although one weird thing is that it does suffer from economies of scale or lack of economies of scale, where it tends to be more useful when you're in a big region. And the antithesis of this is eBay, right? No matter where you are, you can access any product, and as long as you're willing to wait for shipping, you know, you can get whatever you want. There's no it's not locally limited. It's delocalized, and it's also depersonalized in that you'll probably never meet the person you're buying from. Even if you buy a car, they're going to ship the car to you. But because of that, there's a very elaborate reputation system built into eBay. And so even if you do a search and you come up with the product you want, you'll probably buy it from the power seller with the high reputation, with the promises of refunds and fast shipping, all those things. And I'm going to argue that the way we do or have been doing research is kind of Craigslist-ish, but it's becoming eBay-ish. So we each have our department in our university where we have our little seminar to which we invite people to come and travel and stay with us, and they stay for a whole day and they meet with everybody one-on-one and find things to talk about. And then they do dinner. It's very in-person, it's very local, and it leads to a lot of serendipity, And then we have these virtual seminars where we don't travel and everyone's there, and it's very different. So I want to say that make a couple of predictions about this trend, and then, well, actually, let me make 2.5 predictions. My first prediction is the fall of research hubs. I'll talk about what I mean by that. Second is super seminars and their discontents. And the third one is kind of a half prediction. It's more of a question and a warning, and maybe we can do something about it. So let me walk through these real quick. So one of the great things about being in Boston, I've been here for almost 25 years, is people always say, oh, you're so lucky to be in Boston. It's kind of the educational hub of the universe, and there's so many universities. And what you'll hear is, like, we'll hear that a researcher's giving a talk at Northeastern, and we'll email her and say, come a day early and talk to BU, and she'll do that. And then NBER here, and then suddenly she's staying a whole week giving 4 seminars to 4 different groups of 12 people. Right? And doing 30 one-on-ones and 4 dinners. It's very Craigslist, very hyper-local, and a lot of serendipity. And on the flip side, if you're at a university that's in a more remote location, this sort of thing doesn't happen, right? And you don't drop by the NBER seminars every week. And I think this is going away. I think that the advantage of the Bostons and the Washington, D.C.s and the Research Triangles and Silicon Valleys and Manhattans for research is kind of evaporating. I mean, the glass is probably half full, but it's evaporating, right? And there's going to be less of an advantage. And I think people are going to be more willing to move to kind of, flyover country, if you will. And so we may see the rise of flyover country in academia. Not that people, and it's not like Twitter, where Twitter says work from anywhere, you keep your Twitter job. People are actually going to move to institutions that are not in the usual places. Second thing, super seminars and their discontents. Now, I'm not saying there's going to be, by super seminars, I mean virtual seminars that are detached from universities, detached from departments. Seminars like these, probably one of the first was WEFI, Workshop on Entrepreneurial Finance and Innovation. And there's been a strategy entrepreneurship version of that. There's the Health and Pandemics Working Group. And that have really kind of rushed in to fill the void when all of the spring seminars got canceled. So I'm not predicting this will happen. This has already happened. And in many ways, it's been remarkable because it's filled a void again. But also, these have become very democratizing in a way, and that anybody can join. Even the famously insular National Bureau of Economic Research, where you have to be invited to go to the meetings, and people sneak in, but they check for name tags. And for the first time ever, they live streamed publicly the 3-week Summer Institute from NBER. Never happened before. Will it happen next year? I don't know. But this famously closed society opened up. And it's true of virtually any of these virtual seminars. If you want to participate, you can participate. And so on the one hand, this is great, right? Lots of access where we didn't have it before, but I think there's a possible downside, and that is that if this becomes more the norm, then this is like an eBayification of seminars, where there are a few things and we kind of cluster to those. I mean, all these get hundreds of participants. I was on WEFI yesterday listening in. They had 130 people there. Will there be as many department seminars? We'll probably have them, but will people show up? Or will we tend to go to the super seminar where we hear the superstar speakers? And I think whenever there's a new institution, a new journal, they'll recruit famous people to write papers for the journal, and in hopes of establishing legitimacy and going through the teething phase. I think we're seeing that in some of these super seminars, and it's maybe crowding out the opportunity for early career scholars to get an audience. And so I worry about that a bit. And I worry more generally that the kind of serendipity that we get in seminars and in conferences we're kind of losing that. And so I want to end with a couple of thoughts on what we can do about it. I want to start with early career scholars, because I think this is the big worry. So if I turned 50 this year, if you're old like me, and it's maybe less of a concern. Yeah, Chris is laughing at me. Yeah, you knew Chris. But if you're a grad student, if you're a first-year faculty member, like you want to meet your letter writers, you want to get your research out. Like if there's only a handful of super seminars, how do I get on the program? And so here's just a few thoughts. The first is I would submit to a lot of virtual conferences, submit multiple papers, but don't be a drive-by. So show up at these conferences, participate, ask questions, or put in chat if they got chat working. And when you're on these conferences, use them to introduce yourself, because this is one thing we've really lost. One thing about the in-person conference is that people can introduce you to people they know, and that's really hard in the virtual format. So you have to kind of introduce yourself, and private chat is a way to do that. Another way to do it is to send your papers to people. Now, Jackson Nickerson did a video last week, hit a great point. He said, you know, if you send a 34-page paper to somebody and say, I'd love your feedback, they're going to put it on the stack of 34-page papers they already have to look at, and they may not get to it. He said, write a 3 or 4-page extended abstract, maybe one table, because anybody will read that. They'll probably read it the same day. Now, so those are some thoughts for early career researchers. But the real burden, I think, is on the old fogies who are organizing the seminars, who are on the panels. So if someone sends you something to look at, don't just reply, yeah, sure, I'll do it, but tell them when you'll do it. Say, okay, end of next week, and ping me if you don't hear from me. And if you're organizing something like this, avoid the webinar format. I actually don't think this is a webinar Zoom, because at NBER, they used the official webinar Zoom, and you can't see anyone. So we were all sitting there staring at the participant slides. We couldn't see what was going on at all. I know we didn't get the chat working today, but that's a different thing. And my last thought, and I'll get off the slides for this, is to randomize in 2 ways. One is that one way to create serendipity is through these breakout rooms, and you've all used this in your classes. If you're organizing a seminar or a conference, I would do that too. And I've seen this work really well, where you say, okay, 5 o'clock, everyone log in here, and then we split you up into breakout rooms. And that's easy and it's effective. What's less effective, and ironically more work, is to try to do like affinity groups, or say, okay, these 5 people, here's your link, get together. Here's your link, you're in the same topic, you get together. Because we did that for another NBER meeting, and what happened is everybody checked out who's in my group. And they're like, oh, it's just Matt and a couple of other also-rans. And there were 2 people in my chat group. So if you randomize, you'll get people to participate. And I would even consider randomizing participation. If you have more people sign up that can get in. So dirty little secret, a couple of years ago, I was doing this is the last thing I'll say. I was doing the TIM division doctoral consortium. We had about 2 times as many applicants as we could possibly handle. And Miriam Mariani and I were thinking, like, so what do we do? You know, do we try to read what do we do? And we decided eventually to just randomize. And we just picked at random who could attend. And you would not believe the hate mail we got from famous professors saying, why isn't my student in here? Like, they're the best and brightest, they deserve it. And I don't know, my reaction was like, well, we actually don't know if they're the best and brightest. It's so early, we just don't know. And even if they are, maybe they don't need this opportunity as much as other people. So I'm hoping that we can see more leveling of the playing field. And even as we kind of move to an eBay world of conferences and seminars, I hope we can still keep some of the vintages of Craigslist. And with that, I will shut up.
Thank you, Matt, for this Craigslist to eBay, analogy, which is going to stick in my head, as well as for the provocative comments. Why don't we open it up? Just because I think this is, directly addressing many of the participants who are junior scholars with us. Any questions before we kind of move on to Waverly? You can unmute yourself. Well, why don't I, one comment that struck with in my head, right? It was your comment that for those of us who attend conferences, especially small conferences, like such as the Summer Institute, it's incredibly insular. And one advice that was given to me, actually by Ron Burt, was when us, as old fogies, we kind of go to that same conference circuit all the time. sometimes it's important to get out of your comfort zone, right? And after having gone to these conferences in management for quite some time, so for some of you who know, I used to work on political scientists, on U.S. senators for quite some time. And for a number of years, I attended the Political Networks Conference, which was all political scientists and myself. And it was the most disorienting thing ever to walk into a conference and not know a single person. And it's really scary, But for those of you who are, new and entering the domain, we're all in this for the long run. Go out on a limb, introduce yourself. People are not bad. We're always looking for new talent, and people will be very receptive. So don't be too scared about that. Any other questions here before we move on?
Yeah, I have a question.
Absolutely, Philip.
Hi, I'm Philip from RSM in the Netherlands. I thought Matt's thought on this randomization was really interesting with the TIM Doctoral Consortium. I'm not sure if it was the consortium that I attended or not, but I read something similar recently in Research Policy, right? So this Andrew Oswald from Warwick published a paper there arguing for the randomization of publications to a certain degree. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's very interesting. Well, so we were not running an experiment, just to clarify. We just couldn't think of another fair way to do it. I've heard there's some talk of randomizing grants in the proposal process. Yeah, who knows more about that than I do? Suzanne, do you know more about it? You're nodding. Or Valentina? Can you talk about grant randomization? Is that actually happening as opposed to?
Yeah, they do that in New Zealand. So the idea is that when you get to a certain threshold of quality, it's very difficult, and that's the same idea for publications, it's very difficult to differentiate what is really, really good from what is really good and what is really half good. So the idea is that what they did in New Zealand at the Research Council is that when you reach a certain threshold in terms of the evaluation you get, then it's a lottery. Unfortunately, they also discovered that this may actually have some unintended consequences, because if I believe that I'm a superstar, and then that if there's a, let's say, 10% success rate, then I may apply because I think that sort of thing is mine, because I believe I'm in the top 5%, right? But when I know it's a lottery, I may actually decide that it's not worth my time anymore. And I think that they don't know yet if that's the case. I actually have some, at least suggestive evidence in Denmark that may be the case, even if such an experiment has not been conducted. But that could be an unintended consequence. But that's the idea, at least so far, in terms of randomization of funding.
New Zealand, I will check it out.
New Zealand, yes. Sorry.
Henry?
Just quickly, so great talk, Matt. Quickly on the grants, I think the Volkswagen Foundation does it too. And I think the strategy now is to say the really good guys get in based on merit, the really bad guys get kicked out based on merit, and we're just randomizing the middle stratum. So we kind of try to get some of these incentive issues. Matt, on one of the points you make, I think this kind of mega seminar thing, that is really kind of an interesting idea and a scary one, right? And so you say, we should try to avoid it and you should submit as a student to a lot of different places. But it sounds like this is like a nature monopoly network effects kind of things. How are we going to break this, or how do we prevent this from happening, right? Because you have to essentially have organizers commit to not invite the superstars they could get, which means we're not going to get the exposure we want as organizers. So I think it really needs to be a very specific mission, almost like a nonprofit, so to speak, not maximizing numbers, but something else. And CCC actually is thinking about something like this right now, specifically for junior scholars. But it needs to be outside the traditional market system, I guess. But I don't know. Do you have any ideas of how this actually is going to happen? Because incentives are clearly towards just a couple of mega seminars, right? At least it seems that way.
That's such a great point, Henry. So I do worry about the superstar effect and the concentration of seminars. I'm hoping, however, that what we're seeing is kind of a teething effect. So for example, when the American Economic Review launched their Insights journal this year, I think they kind of pre-recruited a bunch of papers from famous people. Maybe not those people's best papers, but give it a year or two, it'll be an established journal, it'll be on the list, and they won't probably have to do that anymore. And my guess is the same will be true for the seminar. that there's kind of this bootstrapping or teething where you had to get the big names for people to say, oh yeah, let me go to this unknown conference because I want to hear Henry present. But maybe next year, the conference is established and then they can invite someone that's, less super famous than Henry to present. So that's my hope. But as an organizer, I think it would be great to intentionally keep spots for young faculty or for grad students. Actually, this is one thing that NBER does really well, especially their productivity seminar. They favor grad students, especially in the fall. And I think that's a great thing for us all to keep in mind. Although, by the way, in all this, I just have to express tremendous gratitude to all those who have organized, and I won't name names, but so many people have jumped in to fill this void and organize these virtual seminars. So I'm not trying to criticize, I'm just saying.
So great. Thank you, Matt. I think we're going to have to, it's 8:35 local time here.
I'm going on mute, sorry.
I would love, I think it's incredibly interesting, this notion of democratization. What sticks in my mind are the issue of journals themselves too, not just conferences, but kind of the venues for the outputs. But let's move on, if that's okay, right? To Waverly. Waverly, are you ready to give us some thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm not as prepared as Matt, so I don't have slides, but let me just take the opportunity to talk about a couple of ideas that I think, to me, the research fronts might be kind of useful for the next few years that I have been thinking about over the summer, particularly related to gender and science in this COVID-19 pandemic environment. So I think two depressing aspects. Let me talk about, I always want to deal with the bad side first and then talk about the less depressing aspect of it. So one of the depressing aspects of this pandemic I see is the issue of time use within families and division of labor within families, right? Because it's like my husband and I is quarreling every day over childcare issues now that we're stuck with an 11-year-old who just showed up and wanting to talk to you guys rather than letting me talk to you guys. So and in this environment that the division of labor tends to be disadvantaged women. So that might open up kind of a front of research on how pandemic introduces a shock to the existing kind of family dynamics, which is disadvantaging women. I mean, the challenge that I'm still kind of thinking about and can't get around it is how do you get hand of the time use data? Because I've been struggling to try to get my hand on the scientist time use data for at least 3 or 4 years. I still haven't figured out how to do that. But nonetheless, it will be a fascinating topic. And the second depressing factor that, I'm pretty confident in predicting this will happen over the next few years is this tendency that existing kind of inequality or the infrastructure for inequality in science is going to get worse when time is bad. And I'm saying this because, so I'm finishing up a paper right now with my colleague Tsushi Oyama at Japan and my colleague Rashi Agwo, in which we look at scientists who got their PhDs and we look at the gender inequality in pay. And guess what? The gender inequality in pay for scientists in academia is not the worst for us, the tenure track folks. It tends to be kind of, it's bad and it's getting worse for non-tenure track people. So it's in the lower tier where you see gender inequality is getting worse and worse, right? And on the industry side, what we find kind of like really fascinating is that industry is actually making a lot of effort trying to narrow the gender inequality in pay. These are all STEM PhDs. But then when we look at 20 years history, what's fascinating is that, so in the good years in the business cycle, industry is actually doing pretty good in narrowing the pay between men and women. But then when we look at the couple of years that's right after downturn, when the labor market is kind of really bad, right? This is where women really suffers. So it's very cyclical in terms of how good times are actually making progress for narrowing the gender pay inequality in science and tech, and how bad times we're facing. And this is why I'm predicting we're going to have a dismal period of really kind of like, even wider gap between men and women in science and tech on a lot of different kind of outcome aspects. So those are the two depressing aspects of kind of outcome that I'm predicting, and I'm thinking about kind of toying around the ideas how to kind of set up our research for it. But then related to what Matt was talking about, the third factor about technology, and particularly the digital communication technology, how that's going to change the nature of, inequality in science. So on that, I see things are going both kind of on both sides, right? You can see the positive side that because IT and communication is narrowing, it's facilitating exchanges that, I remember before my son was born, I was probably flying out 12 every month to different conferences. And once my son was born, now it's reduced to 2 every year. And then when the pandemic hit, I was like, oh, good. So I can go to 2 conferences every month now again, because I don't have to travel. So this IT is really sort of like facilitating people to narrowing the communication gap, and it's helping women and people in more kind of distant, non-hub locations better than those people who are in Boston, right? So that's the bright side. But then the downside is that, as Matt was talking about, you get the winner take all in the digital world. There, it's actually, I think it's not very clear cut as we would worry, because if you look into sociology theories about the status dynamics, so this is the classic piece by Roger Good in one of the older papers in 1980s or 1990s in AJS, right? So what he's showing is that the status dynamics is never going to really kind of end up in the winners take all market seriously, because there's all these local clusters. That's Matt's balkanization idea about, what the social strata in academia is going to be like. Because as long as social exchanges are going on, and those kind of like local exchange dynamics, and the desire for quid pro quo or exchange that, if I pay tribute to a higher status personnel in science, I would want some kind of feedback in return in that social exchange process. So in that sense, it's more likely for me to get some feedback from Matt than someone who is a Nobel Prize winner, right? So it's that kind of social exchange in our life going on that prevents a winner take all kind of like scooping market in the digital world. So that's a kind of like a slightly better kind of outlook than Matt was worrying about. I don't know whether but it's fascinating to think about it when you think about future research topics. So I hope to kind of incite more discussions on those things.
Thank you, Waverly. Thank you. That's fantastic. Yeah, it's a bit heartbreaking, all those studies, right, about how women, especially younger women, right, are just getting pummeled out there. Any questions from the audience about this very important topic? Yeah, Jay?
Yeah, Waverly, I have a question. I was wondering about, the exogenous shock, sort of like think of it as a natural experiment. But I was at this strategy seminar, and and some people were saying that we don't think that, and I think this was a London Business School professor who mentioned that this is not likely to be useful as a natural experiment shock coronavirus, because it within the networks it affects so many different things that it can be difficult to isolate, right, to the typical natural experiment we think about. So I'd like to hear what you think about, because you've been thinking about this as a sudden shock. So yeah.
Right. I think it all depends on what the research question is, and then what the design is like. I mean, like any policy shock, it's going to be noisy, right? It's hard to say one policy shock is shocking everything on every aspect, but to the extent that I'm hoping that there are actually surveys going on and later will be published showing that, let's say, labs open up or universities allow access to labs at different time point and staggered time point across the nation or across the world, and different regions open and close at different time point. And so it's that kind of like variation that allow you to manage within this shock environment to say, okay, that aspect of it varies across in this environment and allows us to do something. Right. So I think still there are opportunity, but it's not as clear cut as it sounds. So with that, if we do we have more questions?
Yeah. Let's follow up with Young-hee. Yes.
Young.
You can. Yeah.
Oh, I just unmuted myself. Yeah. Hey, I have a question for Waverly. So so with regard to your point about gender equality being worse for like lower tier and economic downturns, do you think it is like the institution being more resource constrained and being unfavorable for those people in difficult times, or is it more of a self-selection of those people like giving up their research and leaving the field? Because I think both forces might be playing, but they might have different policy implications.
So my theory is more about the monopoly structure of the labor market. I think in down market, the institutions probably are exploiting women more, given so they become, so this sounds a little bit like counterintuitive, but in an up market, when the labor supply of women is somewhat kind of not at the peak, then institutions are actually responding by suppressing the gap of gender pay because they're responding to men, women equally, right? By playing a heavy hand. But in the down market, when labor supply is actually going up, particularly on the women's front, I think this is what we're predicting, that I think institutions, firms are actually exploiting the oversupply of labor, particularly on the women's front. And that's what's going on.
Yeah. Anybody else?
So with that, can I turn to Chris? Because I would like to ask Chris about his research on the physical access to space, because you have done research about space and location, how that affect the lawmaking process and entrepreneurship. And so in this kind of environment, this is huge, right? Because the scientists are locked out of their labs, and this is going to have some impact on their research.
Yeah, so I think, thank you, Waverly. I think something that's been fascinating to me, right, in part driven by many family relatives or friends who run laboratories, is that these things are completely shut down. Right? So for bench scientists, typically when we talk about bench scientists, there is actually a physical bench, right? This is, a stone place similar to your kitchen countertop where people can do experiments. And suddenly in mid-March, these scientists, right, tens of thousands, 100,000 scientists across the US no longer had access. Imagine that, right? You can't cook anymore. You can't produce results at all. Everything has been shut down. And I can't emphasize enough how traumatic this has been for the community of scientists. As an anecdote, I've only seen this happen once before, when I was actually a practicing scientist on 9/11, right? So at that time, that morning, September 11th, 2001, for the first time for about 12 hours, that was the first time I've ever seen these labs which shut down, which run around the clock, shut down for about, the day, right? And all of us kind of were a bit shocked. And this shutdown is accentuated for months at a time. At this point in time, I think a lot of laboratories have restarted at about 50% capacity. So this is ongoing. So gradually there's a restart. And to come back to kind of Jay's question, I think there's tons of variation, right? You know, if there's one thing that was pounded into me as a grad student many years ago, was go to where the variation is, right? So you look at kind of cross-national rates of transmission from those of you who are, you know, at the end of the day in Europe to those of us having this disaster going on in the US. And even within the US, there's actually quite a bit of variation. Here in Eugene, you know, things are very peaceful, right? You know, the birds are chirping, while, you know, where I grew up in New York City, it is not so good, right? So go to where the variation is and do what you can to control. And I think using that variation, we can see things play out over time, right? So, you know, so I think about this, you know, broadly to frame kind of, you know, to guide research projects, you know, let's think of this as a shock that will affect some and not others of these laboratories. And let's look at, you know, this myriad rate and direction of research and how that will affect things down the road. For those of you, and this is not me, who are so fortunate as to have pre-existing research protocols in place. Let's imagine, right, if we're daydreaming here about time use studies that Waverly pointed out, holy cow, you have a gold mine, right? You know, imagine that you actually had, you know, 50 time use studies of scientists that were ongoing. Wow. I mean, that would be a groundbreaking paper. I assume the vast majority of us are not so lucky. So the question in my mind that has been pressing, right, is if we think about, you know, whether we study, you know, individual scientists, whether we study projects, and whether we study organizational elements, is there something that needs to be done now? In part, I mean, part of the motivation for me to kind of do a pivot on this PDW is there data that actually needs to be collected now that is decaying as we speak? And part of this motivation is, yeah, the labs have restarted, right? You know, they're now at 50% capacity. If I was a betting man, and who knows what the future will bring, I have this sinking suspicion that, you know, with the fall, there may be, you know, a second wave that will come up. And there is the possibility that labs might shut down, right? The whole community of science might shut down again before ultimately restarting at some future point in time, right? You know, one or more possibility of waves. So in that case, you know, if you can get access, I think there's a huge opportunity here to begin studying, right? You know, ex ante, the shutdown process, the restart process. You know, what processes are there? You know, there's a large literature on organizational resilience. A shout out to my colleague, right? You know, to a bunch of my colleague here, Alan Meyer, who has worked on hospitals during times of strike. He had recently an ASQ paper on Ebola and how hospitals respond to Ebola. How do laboratories respond to these shutdowns? How do they restart, right? Can we dig into the organizational processes? If you don't have access to physical space, you know, how do these PIs, these principal investigators, the professors who run this team, right, of between 5 and 30 individuals, how do they coordinate? How do they control when they are physically not in there? I have a friend here who runs a biology lab. He has not been there in months because they're at 50% capacity. He is the manager. He can write grants from home. He doesn't need to take up that capacity versus someone who can actually, you know, grind the bacterial cells and do molecular biology. So, you know, to the extent that, you know, how you know, as people are thinking about the technologies that underlie the science itself, you know, just to be a bit, you know, to be local here, at University of Oregon, we're the center of zebrafish research. And another colleague was remarking to me that this guy is super stressed. He shut down all his zebrafish stocks. He has to rederive them, which is 6 months out. And to get those numbers out and to actually get the key results for his grant to be renewed is another 6 months. So in essence, with these delays on studying vertebrate organisms, it's actually a year lag between restart and actual receiving of these essential results, without which his grant will not be renewed. And as you may know, you know, if the grant doesn't get renewed, that's a literal existential crisis for the labs itself. So how does training occur? I could go on and on. I think that studying, the community of practice within scientists is just it's an incredibly interesting time. And that's what gets me excited about this. Why don't I stop here and open it up to questions? Or why don't I bounce it back to you, Waverly? Did that answer your question to help a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, one follow-on question is that how much of the change going on right now is concurrent change? How much of it is going to stay, right? So scientists are adjusting to this new world. And then the practices change. And there's inertia, right? After they have changed their practice, and maybe they suddenly realize, in the pre-pandemic world, I don't have to collaborate that much. Now, those who will benefit most are actually those who have, a good, healthy collaboration network where they can basically outsource things to a different part of the world to get things done. And that's going to feed back into their future decision loops. I don't know. You predict that things are going to stay with the impact here?
Yeah. So so if you asked me for my prediction, what is the truth? The aphorism is that when the tide goes out, then you know who's actually naked, right? And in this time of trouble, I think if you are wealthy, if you're right at that cusp where you don't have your managerial processes in place, you're going to be in trouble, right? I mean, this is about organizational resilience. Can you respond to this shock, right? And some people will not, right? And it's because, I think about organizational slack. They just don't have the processes set up to be adaptable, and they will fall, So I think there will be a shakeout across the structure, and I think that will have repercussions across, at least across university science. I also believe, right, that it may change the dynamic between the public and private sector, right? Nothing illustrates to me how important, this kind of applied biotechnology is to rush out this vaccine, right? I mean, what is shocking is, all of this work, how can we rush out a vaccine in 1 year when it used to take 20 years? That is in and of itself amazing to me. And that to me speaks about managerial innovations across the last 20 years when, as a biochemist, a vaccine is pretty straightforward. I mean, the how you actually generate the underlying science between how you generate a vaccine hasn't changed in 20 years, but it's the management of the process itself that has changed. And I could see changes in the balance between kind of the public and the private sector, as well as the interconnections between this. So I could see longstanding shifts in which labs will survive. I could see a rebalance between public and private sector. And I could also see a shift in kind of the allocation of labor across the two, the allocation of labor and resources across the two, and I'm sure there's many things that I haven't even thought of. Thanks, Waverly. Why don't we open it up? Any questions? It's 8:57. Valentina, why don't I call you? And then Jenny.
Yes, thank you. So one thing that I've been wondering also about our profession and how this crisis would change is about the mobility of scientists. So we're well known to be a very mobile bunch of people who actually move across institutions, who move across countries, across continents very often. And of course, now we've seen that our mobility is greatly impaired at the moment, and people are stranded in places maybe far from their home or families. And maybe in the future, actually, the willingness of people to move far away from, for example, where they're from or whatever, where they have their roots or their social network, maybe it's going to be lower because they will be afraid that they can't, in a sense, connect as easily as they did before. And that also connects in a bit with Matt's points about maybe we don't need to be in certain hubs anymore, because if we are not meeting physically, then in principle we could be wherever. So I think if you have any of you in a sense has any thought about what this implication has for mobility, and also then for the careers of people, which we know are very often greatly, improved by mobility.
Matt, can I cold call you?
Can I say no? No, so Valentina, I think that's actually what Chris wanted me to talk about, and then I did this Craigslist eBay thing. There's a long-standing debate kind of between economists and sociologists about whether it's best to develop firm-specific capital that's uniquely valuable to your employer and then hope that they reward you for that versus playing the field and changing jobs, or at least getting offers and threatening to change jobs. And I'd say the literature has kind of come out on that second side. And that's actually one reason I study non-competes, because they makes it hard to move, it makes it hard to earn more. And my gut says I think there will be a temporary slowdown in mobility. But I think that's one part of this that will be back to normal. Now, I could be wrong though, because you mentioned something I'd never thought about, which is that people might be reluctant to move further from family. That is something I had not thought about. I was thinking more about the geographic expansion of possibilities and how people won't be reluctant to go live in Eugene, if I can use your example, Chris, or Western Maryland, where I'm from. How they, because people are always saying, oh, like, I want to come to Boston. Are you hiring at BU? I don't think that's going to happen as much anymore. But the social connections are a good question, Valentina. That's a very good question.
We shall see how that plays out, right? I mean,
yeah, I don't know.
We live in exciting times for social scientists,
But we have to be careful about using coronavirus as an instrument. I think it's like the world's worst instrument, because it's going to fail every exclusion restriction that you've ever heard of. So we have to be really careful there.
It's not quite weather, is it? But Jenny, did you have a question?
Yeah. Thanks so much for organizing this. What I think is such an interesting and valuable theme that has emerged from Chris, your talk, Matt, Waverly, is just structural differences in access and kind of equality, equity that were pre-existing, but that the pandemic has exacerbated, and it's sort of like the tide going out. Matt talked about this incredibly elite and closed exclusive club of NBER. Waverly's talking about like men and women. Everybody knows moms do more, and we've just, and Chris, like labs, some are professionally managed, people actually use professional management skills, and most probably don't. And like kind of status quo and abundance has allowed us to paper over some of those differences or pretend they're not there. And this is just like, removing that. And I don't know if there's a way to generate papers out of that, seeing how, like we're just exacerbating these pre-existing differences. But it's just such an important, I think, theme that you guys have all brought out. So thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. My clock says it's 9:02. I promised you that it would be about an hour or so, so I do know that I want to let you go, but I will stick around and have a conversation here. Yeah?
I'll stick around with Chris as well.
Absolutely. So I guess just I'm happy to continue the conversation, but some closing remarks is kind of the not so implicit, but I will flat out say explicit goal of this PDW is to kind of promote managerial research on the organization of science. We're all here because this is something that's dear to our hearts. I expect to, we're all in this for the long run. You will all be old fogies, as Matt puts it, at some point. And my hope is that, by being part of this community, it'll make research kind of more vibrant. It'll bring a lot of new scholars to this important topic. So keep in touch and welcome to this community. And I hope to see you guys for many years to come. We hope to reprise the Organization of Science PDW, hopefully in person, in Academy for the following year. And I hope to see you then. Okay, thanks to Matt and Waverly especially, and also a shout out to Eliza for arranging this, and to Tim, to Marianne Feldman, and to Janet Berkowitz. Thank you all for attending, and you can shoot me, sorry about the comments, you can shoot me some comments offline. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for organizing it.
Hey, David, you're off mute. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to stick around till I didn't want to take up the time. One thing that I was thinking about is what has really changed, not necessarily from the individual level, but at the kind of societal level in the production of knowledge in this episode. I kind of think that we've talked about the possible death of hubs when it came to digitalization. Like, why would we, get on an airplane? Or what's the exact advantage now that we have this thing, the internet, that wires us all? And I think that, for sure there's differences. Time budgets are reallocated, resource budgets are reallocated with COVID. But one thing that I got very interested in is this idea that I think this literature is really pointed to as quite important, which is the social role of the production of science, and how that is going to change how we conduct research across all different kinds of organizations. And so I was thinking, yeah, there's, I've already seen some work with, okay, once we get our vaccines and go back to normal, we're just going to kind of adopt the good stuff, like the chat function of Zoom, and then we're just going to kind of go back to business as usual. The extent of this time period of quarantine has been so significant. My prediction is that we're actually going to change our habits. I don't expect to be getting on nearly as many airplanes, as before, even post-vaccine. And so that leads me to think, what kind of research do I expect coming out? Suppose that this is like a long run production of knowledge phenomenon that's very widespread. And I suspect there's going to be a ton of innovation. If I'm a wet lab scientist, I can't get in to my lab, I'm just going to say, okay, I'm just not going to, I'm going to have to really think hard. Could I model this thing on a computer? Could I test this core assumption? Actually, one thing that struck me in this kind of discussion that you guys had about social, sampling different things, my instinct has been, oh, now I can just kind of pop in rather than doing like the kind of all-in game,
right?
Which I agree for junior faculty, that's really important. But now it's kind of like all of a sudden the cost to me of sampling, suppose I could get the invitations to just listen in to a targeted session on, I don't know, Bayesian statistics, that I'm not a member of that community, but I've always been curious about this really, specialized thing. Maybe I can just kind of, with the right architecture, as you guys say, like having that, that virtual, those chat rooms is brilliant. Like I see it on my students. There's just a ton of social connections created, which let me think, hey, I'm going to be going into teaching in the classroom. Maybe I could just do some kind of proto experiment. And this is not, production of science, but just like how effectively am I being able to manage a classroom? Maybe in some sections, I don't do the chat room and versus others that I do, and then have some well-identified outcome in terms of innovativeness of ideas that they, give them a task, have them, with all their various backgrounds, even randomized, get into that chat room. Hey, what's your best solution? Or I could even probably, if I were a psychologist, I would have some well-designed measures of how creative were you at this task at hand. So I actually think that this is, and I'm going on far too long, but I think that this is an opportunity where I expect actually the standard deviation of outcomes, controlling for all that other stuff, resources for sure, time budgets, time allocation. But I actually wonder if we're going to get some really out of the box thinking as a result of these forced constraints. Usually when we talk about innovation, it's kind of like, I'm trying to innovate because I got this problem, right? This engineering mentality, I got to problem solve this. We have massive constraints now. And maybe that pressure, out of that pressure, we get a few diamonds. I don't know. What do you guys think? Especially with related to the social aspect.
So I absolutely agree, right? I mean, I think that this is a transient shock. And I think that, we know that organizations change during times of crises, and that kind of spurs on innovation, et cetera. So I think many organizations, right, many scientists aren't going to go back to business as usual. And I also agree that, in some ways, if I was predicting, it would be kind of what I think was the professionalization of scientists. You look at junior scientists, you look at any junior grad students, there's a ton of time wasted, right? If you are only going to be allowed to go in for a set number of hours, imagine this without experiments. Imagine we can only be on Stata for an hour a day.
Right.
And versus those of us, going into the wee hours, running a gajillion models. If you only had an hour a day, you're going to have to be much more thoughtful, much more proactive in designing experiments and what you do. By contrast, though, I'm a little bit less optimistic. I mean, what I hear from you, David, is that there are going to be diamonds that come out of here. But what maybe because I'm not a pessimist, I'm an optimist. Let me point that. But the pessimistic outcome that I would say from this is that, this might make people do more ordinary science versus kind of, it might inhibit breakthroughs. It might force people to be less exploratory and be more exploitative with their limited time. But the fact that we're at odds here, anytime you have opposite predictions, that's always, interesting, in my mind, a good starting point for.
The thing that's really hard to hold constant here is, your comments led me to think. I once had this really interesting conversation with Ian Coburn, Matt's current colleague. He said that when he started his career, he was back in the day of the punch cards on computing. He's like, if he screwed up that regression on his hour of between, as a grad student, I guess he had allocated the 2 a.m. to 3 a.m. slots. If he screwed it up, he has to wait another 24 hours to run that regression. By contrast, now we're running, in parallel, crazy models, costless, right? And so I agree that that's an apples to oranges comparison. We're not we need to kind of level up to where we are technologically in today's age and think about, okay, given that we have certain things that are costless, computing time, right, costless virtually, the scarce resource, and this gets to the debate about the social aspect of the production of knowledge, which is what is truly scarce here when it gets to breakthrough ideas. And I would argue it's not the, computing power. It's about the time. Now, actually, since I've been in my home largely for the last 5 months, before it's kind of like 1,000,001 things coming up. When was the last time I had the luxury of joining it in a discretionary PDW in which I was not the panelist? Never, right? And so these serendipitous things in which I have the time to actually think, and try to put together some puzzle pieces, I actually think that those hard to connect, it's the ordinary work. I agree. If I'm pre-tenure, I got to kind of show that I can actually run some regressions. But for truly breakthrough stuff, we actually need to have some time, have some considered, feedback from colleagues. I need to maybe tool up or think about some non-obvious linkages to other fields. And so, yeah, of course, I don't have the crystal ball, but just as a counterpoint to what you were saying.
Yeah, but let me, so my colleague, Paula Stefan, my colleague Paula Stefan used to say, we should pay more attention to the division of labor.
Waverly, can you be a bit louder?
All right, so 1 second. Does this help?
Yeah.
Okay, hear me now? Is it better? Putting to the loudest. Okay, so I think there's this aspect of division of labor in science, right? So this is basically going to change in terms of the division of labor. And actually we're dealing with two shocks. One is the pandemic, other is all the immigration hurdles that Trump administration is creating, which is going to making US losing international students, particularly in health sciences, right? I don't know whether Europe is going to gain, but in combination, this is driving the labs to increase the span of collaboration internationally and division of labor. And so I'm kind of anticipating a shift of the production of science from like US-based labs into a broader field down the road. And that might be pointing to the brighter side of production, because then you're going to get better division of labor, faster turnaround, and better quality science, so more breakthroughs down the road. I don't know, but the boundary has been.
What I'm hearing, right, and again, I think, Waverly is saying that this might lead to expansion of science. I think I could also make the argument that it could induce a narrowing of science, right, which is also very similar to the counterpoint to David, where he's talking about exploration and having more time. I'm saying it might lead to a narrowing and kind of more exploitative behavior. Again, I mean, I would love, typically when I think about research projects and you have these opposing predictions, that always makes me point to moderators, which is what I heard in David's comment, which is kind of career cycle or gender, or are you in US versus, I don't know, where was it, New Zealand, where they're getting the randomized grants? Look for those moderators. And there's a lot of work to be done. But I'm gonna shut up and JC, can I call on you, JC? And then
I don't have much to add. Sorry, was my hand up?
I thought your hand up, but that's fine.
Oh, sorry, that was clapping. That was applause.
That is that clapping? I maybe I'm colorblind here. And so Young-hee, were you clapping or did you have a comment? Did you have your hand raised? I am clearly.
I think that was clapping too.
Oh, so sorry. Yeah. Thank you for clapping. Anybody else?
I just want to quickly say that the view that I expressed neglects something that is actually quite important that's been surfaced in this discussion as well as others, which is I am talking about either an average effect or an outlier effect. We have to worry about, I kind of wave to the side, let's hold constant time, budget, resources. That is a big deal, right? When it comes to thinking about inequality, access, differential access, I don't think that we've done enough as a profession to really explore that aspect, right? Usually we are looking at, the privileged, those that don't have to worry about those things at institutions that already have those resources, et cetera. And I think that this may be a really great opportunity to examine the impact and to actually document it scientifically, because I think a lot of these, just to take our own field, I've heard anecdotally lots of institutions that have basically cut their research budgets almost down to zero, right? Including not my own, but like at my own institution, no travel through December. That's not that big of a deal, right? Because I don't think anyone's getting on airplanes. But in terms of, there are literally some institutions that have just said, this year, forget about your discretionary research budgets. Like that's kind of, that's cutting pretty hard, right? And I don't want to pretend that even if you don't, there's going to be a minimum threshold of resources in order to attain the exploitation, et cetera, or the exploration. And so putting a spotlight around, these time, as we've been seeing about time allocation issues, differential impact on households, families, et cetera, and the role of management and organization in the face of those constraints, I think is really, I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot more really interesting studies emerge on that exact point. But I don't want to monopolize the sun.
No, I think that's a great point, and that is true. I hear from my scientist friends that this discretionary budgets, and they're not 5 digits. I mean, these are hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? They can't touch the grants because the grants are from the universities. I mean, from the grant funding agencies. But you can't work if you got no money, right? If you're a bench scientist. Jackie, can I believe this is a hand.
Yeah, it is. I tried. It is, yes. I tried clapping a couple of times thinking, oh, maybe that, but anyway, okay, so no, it is a hand. Yeah, it's really interesting conversation, and I wanted to make the point, if it hasn't already been made, that because the supply of resources will, we're anticipating to become, are constrained and will anticipate to become maybe more constrained during COVID-19. Having less supply of resources for research certainly might move things from exploration to exploitative. And that has an impact, we'd anticipate that would have an impact on adding diverse voices. Adding diversity of voices to research requires an exploration, and without that, those diverse voices, over time, we might find that during this period, we, as academics, become even further entrenched in incumbent theoretical frameworks. On the other hand, there might be the opportunity at this time, I think as you mentioned, Chris, go where there are big differences. So to go where, there's big effects that will happen now. So maybe this is a time to study what this kind of resource constraint can mean on diverse voices and exploration.
Thank you, Jackie. Waverly, can I cold call you as, diverse voices, I mean, you think about this, double whammy of being young and female, early in your career and female. That is a voice that should be heard, right? That you would argue will be suppressed, right? For a multitude of reasons.
Yeah. So I'm pessimistic. So I think regarding this kind of environment will probably take even more effort than the usual environment, which will require you to engage in some of the things that Matt was talking about, right? Being really proactive in kind of putting yourself into the scene, into a conversational stream, and getting your face there, getting your voice there, reaching out to people who might be writing letters to you. But this is, as I said, this is also, it's hard to say whether this is not also an opportunity because of the increasing division of labor in science, that a particular piece of domain that you sit on with very strong expertise will become part of an important agenda in coming up with better science, because today is the time when it's really hard for a particular lab located in one location to monopolize the direction of science, right? So the way I'm seeing it is that it's getting, the scale and scope is getting broader and broader, so which basically means that the good stuff necessarily will come out of bigger range of collaborations and with more kind of division of labor in the process, which basically means anybody who is sitting on domain expertise stands better odds to be successful in this process. So, yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Yes. Thanks, Waverly. Any last questions? It's 9:23 local time. I want to thank you again, right, for all of you who have stayed on, for all your time, right? I mean, we're all in this for the long run. I think we could talk about this for several more hours, but definitely I hope that we can talk about this in person next year at Academy, or in any of these mini conferences in between. Thank you again. Thanks. All right, I will stay. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Everybody.
All right. Thanks, Waverly. And as we go down to 10, if there's anybody who does have more questions, this is a topic I'm committed to, so please feel free. Waverly, I will talk to you. It's good to see you.
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. That's right. We're talking tomorrow. I haven't thought beyond this morning, but good. Hope that things